I'm going to flick between slides and sort of talking to camera. So sort of bear with me on that if occasionally it takes, I get it slightly wrong. And as well as MISP, which is a charity, and that's a really important, it's a UK charity, it's a very important part of what we do is offering mindfulness to as many people as we can. But the ground of a lot of what I'm doing was at Tonbridge School, and still is at Tonbridge School, which is where I teach. And being a school teacher myself is an absolutely key part of learning about how to bring mindfulness to schools, because it is not, as I will explain in this talk, completely straightforward. And the challenges that I face, every day teaching kids keep me fresh, because there's no easy way of doing this. And I'd love to know how many of you are school teachers, or how many of you are working in schools, or how many of you here are more as parents. But I really encourage you to kind of open your minds to take in what I'm saying, because I think it's easy to misconceive what we do in schools. So our mission is to, now that sun's going to shine through there, so apologies if you can't see me all the time, or maybe that's better actually. But our mission, the mission of Mindfulness in Schools Project, is to bring mindfulness to young people and those who care for them. And that's very important. Those who care for them, that's an important part, and that could well be you. And bringing mindfulness to you, and the mindfulness playing a role in your lives, is the key first step, obviously, to bringing it to schools. And we've done this with a lot of people, 6,000 teachers we've trained so far, just over now. We estimate, it's very hard to tell, but we estimate that's about 450,000 children. That's a reasonably conservative estimate in terms of how many kids we've reached. And my ambition today is to talk about the foundation of teaching mindfulness in schools. The objective of what we're doing is the key, because what is our objective when we're bringing mindfulness to schools? And I think I probably share this with most of you, that we're looking for the flourishing of young minds. And I think you might have seen a lot of data today. You might have seen lots of graphs. I'm not going to show you too many of those, but I will share this one with you, which was put together by, it was just an illustration of intention. Obviously, there's no data in this graph. It's a bell curve of well-being, and it was a model, if you like, of Felicia Huppert, who was right at the beginning of MISP. She was running a piece of research for Cambridge Wellbeing Institute, and she wanted a curriculum to test, to do a proper, thorough piece of research. Well, actually, it was a pilot study piece of research for the Cambridge Wellbeing Institute, and that's what led myself and Chris Cullen and Chris O'Neill to write.b. But what I think is important about this is that we're not always looking over here, which is those people who are really struggling with mental health, and nor are we necessarily always looking over here, which is sort of elite sport or elite music, for example, which is where it can have a real impact. We're looking at the whole range of well-being. And I don't know where you are on this curve, how you're feeling even right now this morning, whether you're feeling more languishing and tired or flourishing, but whether at the heart of it, where you would put yourself on this, and where would you put the children that you work with on this? And in a sense, it doesn't matter, because mindfulness has something for all of those people, potentially all of those people. And if we can just move the whole of that bell curve over towards the right there, what a difference that would make. I'm not going to talk in detail about the benefits, and I presented this last time, and I'm assuming that many of you will have been at the presentation that I gave last year, or that you'll be familiar with these. But there are 4 areas where we see mindfulness particularly benefiting young people, and mental health is one of those. Cognition is another one, attention, concentration, planning, working memory. We call that executive function. I think executive function brings a lot of these things together. In fact, executive function almost brings all of these together, tends to be bracketed a little bit more within cognition. But social and emotional, relationships, self-esteem, trust, optimism, and also behavior. And what we don't mean is using mindfulness as a disciplinary technique. this is one thing that always worries me slightly. Is I know that there was, just have a break from that. I know there was a school in America that if you got into trouble and you got sent to detention, then you were given mindfulness as a kind of behavioral management tool. That worried me a little bit. This idea that if you're naughty and if you're bad, if something's wrong, then we'll give you mindfulness. The rest of you just carry on as normal. And that's where I'd be a little bit concerned about it being presented as that. The word I quite like in terms of what it helps with is what we sometimes call oppositional behavior. And so it's not necessarily that somebody is misbehaving, but more that their reactivity is quite high, and that there's always that sense of opposition between that child and other children, or between the teacher and that child. And there's something nice about mindfulness, even in quite difficult contexts, that it can sometimes just take the sting a little bit out of that sense of antagonism, oppositional behavior. So I hope that gives you a sense of what mindfulness can do, but it isn't actually, for me, the key. And I think the problem is that those four things put it into silos. They sort of quadrant it off into something very instrumentalized. And I am very keen that rather than seeing it like that, we talk about mindfulness as something which opens possibilities. And there are many possibilities. This was a word that came out of a dissertation that I did, and I was lucky enough to interview some of the leading figures in the mindfulness field way back in the early days. This was in 2007 to 2009. And in the paper that I wrote following that, it was, how can we bring together mindfulness when you've got some people learning it in a non-secular Buddhist context, and you've got other people who are learning it in a clinical context. But of course, what I've realized is it's not even as polarized as that. It's a whole range of possibilities that mindfulness can help with. And this, I'm going to show you a little slide here that I'll leave you to kind of explore. This is a page that I use when I've started my more, I wouldn't call it an advanced course, but so what happens at Tonbridge where I teach is we teach all year 10. We give a very brief introduction to mindfulness. I say a brief introduction. Dot B is dipping their toes in it. But then quite a few people sign up to carry it on as a kind of voluntary activity. And with those people, what I do is I say, okay, so you've touched the mindfulness space a little bit. You've done a bit. You know what I'm talking about here. But why? Why are you interested in this? And these are all and I ask them to pick the image or the images that resonate with them, so that when I'm working with a group of 15 to 20 kids, often with these sort of volunteers that are carrying it forward, I have a sense of where they're coming from. Now, for some of them, that might be up here in top left, this sort of anxiety, even depression. And I'm going to talk much more about the key element of integrating pastoral care more generally in your school with your mindfulness practice. So it might be sort of in that in that space. Okay. For others, it might be very different. It might actually be about, say, sport and high performance sport and stress and performing under pressure. Those of you who aren't familiar with that, that's an image of Jadon Sancho, an English player who missed a penalty, which unfortunately, had consequences for our World Cup hopes. And this poor young man, the mental, the turmoil that you go through both before you take a penalty in high pressure situations and afterwards is immense. For other people, it might be completely, they might have no interest in this at all. They might be down here. They might be very hardworking, academic, wanting to do well in their exams. Others might be more over here, which is, they might be aspiring to do work. They might have a job. If they're at university, they might already have got something for what happens afterwards. How do they manage that? Others, it might be about their music. Others, it might be about their anger. Some might have heard that physical pain is something mindfulness can help with. Some might be aware that they're completely lost in their tech. They can't get out of their tech. Others might be much more poetic about it. It might be about the senses, about just, that feeling, getting that lovely feeling of, walking on grass, bare feet, or on sand. Some might be more scientific. They might just be interested in it as a sort of, they've heard mindfulness works. What is it doing? What is it doing to the brain? And others might actually come at it. I've put a picture of a Buddhist monk here, but they might come at it from a different faith background. Some might hate the idea of faith, but they might have an idea of what they might call spirituality. And others like it because they get angry with their brother when he nicks their Xbox and they want to start shouting at him. So you have this huge range of applications of mindfulness. And that is what you have to begin with to some extent, because there's no point in teaching to this group if most of them are in this group. And the way that you will teach them will vary, will shift to some extent, depending on why they're there. And that is so knowing your audience, knowing the young people you're working with is a really important part of what you're doing. Now, this is that you are. I hope you don't mind me using this as an experiment to some extent, because I've taught foundations of mindfulness in schools so often. I thought it'd be lovely to do it in a slightly different way. And what I come back to actually is a paper that was written in 2018 by this person here. Stephanie Wilde was the main. She was the main writer, if you like. That she was the one who came into the schools, and she visited lots of schools. And she wrote a paper, a qualitative paper effectively, on identifying the cornerstones of implementation. Now, this word here, implementation, is the key word. How do you implement mindfulness in schools? Now, when we wrote .b, we thought that we cracked it. We've written a great curriculum. The kids we teach love it. It seems to work in different kinds of schools, whether that's an independent school, a pupil referral unit, whether that's a state school, a private school, a grammar school. It seems to work. We've written something that works. And we thought that was it, job done. No, just absolutely not. We realized after a while that actually that was probably 10% of the job done. The 90% of the job to do was, how do you bring that into a school? Because schools are complex places. And I'm going to talk you through the 4 things that Stephanie and her co-authors in this paper picked as being the cornerstones, if you like, of implementation in a school. The first one of those is people. And I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about people. Okay, I'll show you the 4 first. The second one was perceptions in a school. The third one is the resources of that school. And finally, this one, it's not really a thing so much as a metaphor, I suppose, which brings all of these together. What Stephanie meant when she wrote this, and the team when they wrote this, was about the journey is recognizing that your school will be on a journey, and that can go up and down. And I suppose, again, talking to you now, I would invite you to reflect on where you are in all of this. Yeah, I want this. And if you're a parent as well, where you are perhaps, or where your child is, either in their school or in their relationship with you. I'm going to change one thing slightly here. This paper focused on people as one of the 4 elements. I'm going to change that to community. And certainly with my colleagues at MISP, we increasingly see this word community coming to the fore. Part of that was because of a constant challenge of thinking, right, who are the beneficiaries of the charitable work that we do? Is it the children we're serving, or actually is it the teachers that we're serving? And there wasn't an answer to that, because it's both. But when you think of those as children over here and teachers here, that still becomes quite a quite a polarized way of seeing our 2 beneficiaries, the 2 groups of beneficiaries. You use the word community in a school, and all of a sudden it all comes together, because it isn't just the pupils, it isn't just the teachers, it's also the parents, it's also the governors, it's also the support staff, and it's the whole ecology of a school, which is at the heart of successfully implementing it. So looking at community first, some of you might have seen this. I haven't used this for a few years, but I'm coming back to it now, because it seems, interestingly, a lot of what I used to say is coming back. It feels like we're in the field, we're on a wave to some extent, on a journey, particularly in schools, because a lot of what we found originally, even though mindfulness as a field is changing, still holds true. And I'm going to use the example of Springfield Elementary School from The Simpsons, of course, and I'm just going to talk you through the characters in a school and the characters in a school community and where they fit into. So the first character is this. I've used this to represent the grass activist, the passionate mindfulness person, the one who's a bit more cutting edge, who got there first, who loves mindfulness, who practices mindfulness, who wants to get it into their school. Okay, that's the first person. Second person is the head teacher. And the head teacher is representing here. This character represents obviously not just the head, but the senior team of the school. And I would say those two are probably at the core of the implementation, because you can't really do anything without the grass activist who really understands it. But unless this person has the not just the approval, but well, ideally the approval of this person, but definitely doesn't have this person blocking. Okay. That was one of the things that came out in the Stephanie's research that I was talking about, was that it was very hard if you had a head teacher that was blocking implementation, and that does happen. And I have seen that happen. I've seen that happen in a very well-established school in the UK, where the head teacher was just not into it, and that was a shame, because he had some very, very talented mindfulness people sort of in his staff. But unless the head teacher is on board, you're gonna run into difficulties. At least they mustn't block it. Ideally, they'll be supportive and help you implement, but if they block it, that's when you've got difficulties and you have to be terribly mindful and patient. Now, we do, of course, have these little fellas over here. And obviously, we have all sorts of different pupils. And there are 6, Simpson characters here, all of whom are very different in their own ways. But obviously, this represents, in the school where I teach, 800 kids. I don't know about the schools where you teach, but you have to also recognize that even if this person is on board and even if this person on board, the needs of these ones over here are going to be different, and they're going to be in different age groups. And it's going to make a difference if you teach them when they're 11, because they're different to when they're 12, to when they're 13, to when they're 14. Kids, particularly in that adolescent bracket, are changing so rapidly. Something, again, I'm going to come back to, that you have to adapt your teaching to cater for them. Now, over here, I wonder where you are, or on this one, or who you might know here, we have the teachers. Here we have the humble, quiet teacher, not getting in the way. And then we have the what you might call the old guard. There's an old music teacher here, some of whom might be very skeptical about this newfangled mindfulness nonsense. And then you have, maybe perhaps your boffin, your hardworking, earnest teacher. Then you have your sports teacher, who some of whom might love it, some of whom are terribly practical and what is all this rubbish that you're doing here? Get on the field, play hard. Those are these are all, obviously these are stereotypes. So what I'm trying to do is bring to life the texture of a school teaching community. You might have somebody, and it might be that their mindfulness teaching is not actually about the kids, it's about them and how they come across. And then you might have, again, a nice, well-meaning teacher. And then, of course, I love this one, you have the eccentric. And if you have the eccentric on side, the slightly crazy teacher, some of the kids absolutely love, some of the kids think she's bonkers, but actually that kind of teacher can also be tremendously helpful. But where are you? Where are the teachers? And how does mindfulness sit with this wonderful group of characters here? You then have the governors. Okay, now a governor is obviously on the board of a school. They have authority as well. And whilst they might not be completely immersed every day, again, they hold a lot of power, and they're important in terms of representing the school and approving of what the school is doing. And then over here, you have the parents. Yeah, and the parents, again, I don't know what kind of parent you are. I'm sure you've met a few Ted Flanders out there. But what are the parents feeling about this? Because if the school thinks it's great, but the parents thinks it's nonsense, then you're in one realm. On the other hand, if the parents really want it, which is often the case we're finding, if there's a push from the parents, then that might be what actually brings these fellas around. That might actually begin to help. But I'm going to come back initially to this person here, the grassroots person. And I just want you to have a read of this, because how the teacher themselves is in the classroom is key. And I just want to sort of talk about that for a bit, because you as teachers, or as parents indeed, it isn't what you teach a lot of the time. It isn't, what you tell your kids. It's how you are. And that's what they remember. We talk, I don't know if you've heard this expression in teaching, but we talk about there's the court, there's the taught, and there's the court. There's the taught is what you teach. Yeah. That's one thing. And that might be maths, that might be chemistry, that might be French, that might be Spanish, geography, history, English, whatever. But there's what they catch from you, what is caught, how they are with you. And when you look back at your own childhood and you look back at your school experience, what do you remember? Do you actually remember? I mean, obviously, you're going to remember, I hope, some of the factual material that you've been given, but often it's a sense. You remember that teacher because they did this, and when they came into the class, they walked in that funny way, or they used to always say "oh" a lot, or they used to say "well," and you used to keep a little count in your book of how many times they said one word. As teachers, often we don't realize we use the same word again and again, and the kids are keeping a tally, placing bets on it. Kids are mischievous, and it's why I love teaching them. It's why I get such energy from them, because it's always new. Teaching is never boring. You're always in front of a different group of, not, well, it might be the same group of kids, but it's a different time of day. They're in a different mood. You're in a different mood. But that caught and taught is key. You are the key to the climate of the classroom, as that says there. And that is where mindfulness can play an immense role, because if it can make you more aware of them and more aware of how you're reacting to them, and give you a bit more space in how you respond, even to the ones that really wind you up, whether that's a parent or a teacher, that gives you just a lot more agency in a good way. And that's why the first foundation, if you like, of mindfulness in the classroom is that you have to be practicing yourself, and not you. It has to be making a difference to your life. Now, I'm sure that most of you watching have seen this slide before. I'm guessing that 90% of you are already practitioners and loving mindfulness. If you're not, I would say this is the first thing, is make sure you learn it yourself. Perhaps if you're watching this talk as someone who's just curious about the field, but just as they say on the planes, put it on yourself first and then give it to the child. That's kind of the message that we're constantly giving. And I would say, don't forget this, because I think it can come to a stage where you think you know it. You're the mindfulness guy, the mindfulness teacher, you know it. And then you're just teaching that. But remember that we have to keep learning. We have to keep putting that oxygen mask on to keep learning. And the other thing that I would say is, it's so important, because you wouldn't put your child into a swimming pool with a teacher who can't swim. And you don't want to be putting your child into a classroom where a teacher is teaching something about mindfulness that they don't really understand themselves, because it's not only unhealthy to do that. I do think there is a risk, and I'm becoming increasingly aware of this. And I'd like to talk about breath and breathing, which a lot of you, any of you who are here at the beginning of the practice, you will have heard me mention this. Breath is something which I almost guarantee, and I think I mentioned this last time, but I'm going to repeat it because it is a foundation of mindfulness teaching in schools, that we are aware of these things. It is always the case that when you're teaching, if you teach a class of 30 kids, I guarantee there will be at least 3 kids, I would say, who don't like paying attention to breath, who are uncomfortable with paying attention to breath, and I wouldn't say it is harmful in that sense, if you are very aware and giving them permission not to pay attention to their breathing. So when you're giving instructions about noticing your breathing, it is absolutely key to say, if you're comfortable with that, and if you're not, just feeling your feet on the floor, listening to sound, opening your eyes, and give them an exit. I'm interested in this because I've been reading a lot. Willoughby Britton is a very good academic who's written in this space. And whilst most of the negative impacts of meditation happen in retreat contexts where it's very intense, and remember, we're talking about dipping children's toes in here. We are not putting them into a 10-day silent meditation retreat. We are dipping their toes. But I do think 2 things. One, we have to be aware that some won't like particularly paying attention to breathing for whatever reason. But the second thing is, never teach to a class of kids unless you have the whole context of the pastoral care of those children. And this is why we're so reluctant for instance, people saying, I teach kids online, just sign up here and your kid can get a mindfulness lesson online with an experienced teacher. That is not something MISP supports unless that teacher is working and that child are sitting within a broader well-being context. So there will be children who are suffering, who are struggling. You need to know that that's happening when you're leading practices, so that your interaction with the DSL, the designated safeguarding lead, if that's in a UK school, that's the term we use. Child protection officer is what it used to be called, and also the counsellor. And perhaps if that year group has a tutor, and just before you begin teaching, make sure you've checked in with those various people, because it's really important that you know. And I would make that comparison with physical exercise. It's a good comparison. For most people, going on a run is a great thing to do, but there will be people who can't do that for physical reasons. They might have an injury, they might be carrying some condition or other, which at that time or always means that physical exercise is not a good thing for them in the way that it's being done. And I do think it's very important that we're mindful of that as teachers. So that's a really important foundation there. So then I'm going to go on to perceptions. Okay. Now, perceptions are always going to change, and they're always going to be very connected with community. Okay. But let me give you what, again, this for me is my real bugbear, I think, in the mindfulness space. This was the cover in 2014. Now, when I saw that, we were already MISP was already quite well established, and we were kind of very happy, celebrating, because, mindfulness and the mindfulness revolution made the front cover of Time. And I did notice at the time, did they have to pick an attractive blonde lady for their cover? Did they have to do that? Isn't that beginning to put it, in a particular category of leisure, actually, is where it's putting it. And then, of course, the famous Ladybug book of mindfulness came out. Again, this might be a UK perspective, but I'd be surprised if that wasn't pretty global, which again kind of characterized this blonde, quite floaty lady. And then over here, we have we have somebody meditating with the classic posture, which again, all of you who have done mindfulness know that it's so much more than that. It isn't just that, and it certainly isn't only for these people. But I suppose what I'm working with here is perception. And what is astonishing is that whilst this grew out of, for instance, the Buddhist psychology, and has been and meditation and contemplation and practices of silence and practices of stillness, in all the world's faiths, there is room for these. So they have a very deep, meditation in one form has a very, very deep roots that go back thousands of years. But we've kind of ended up here to some extent. We've ended up in the territory of mindfulness. I say we've ended up. There are still lots of people doing brilliant, deep work. So I'm not saying this is all we've ended up with, but there is an awful lot of mindfulness around. And those perceptions there, and I'll go back to these, are something I think really as a field we have to be aware of. And it's also very important in schools. How is mindfulness perceived in schools? Schools are often academic, usually academic places. You will have skeptics. You will definitely have people who say, what is all this about? And they've had no interest in it before. So all they've seen are those images that I've just shown you. And that's what they're associating mindfulness with. Now, we're doing our best in Mindfulness in Schools project to work around that. We have inclusion groups, which I hope please check out our website for that, because we are trying to stress how broad mindfulness is. But that isn't going to help you in your school. What's going to help you in your school is knowing who are the blockers, who are the people who are kind of thinking, who just don't know anything about it. It's almost always because they just don't know and they don't understand. And so you have to find ways of communicating with those people or communicating with the staff as a whole, but also being terribly patient. And and I really say this from experience that there are some people you're never going to convince, but again, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't matter if everybody on board. But what you want to do is just help everybody to understand that mindfulness really has something to offer, and to make sure that you gradually chip away at the blockages, if you like, that you will have in your school. Now, in perception, I'm going to talk about this, apps. Okay, I'm going to bring up pictures of 6 apps, which I think in many ways are doing great things. I've used all of these. I've seen all of these work in different ways, in different spaces. I think, though, what is interesting is that these are determining, it is apps that are determining what mindfulness is, for better or worse, certainly in young people's minds. And what we have to do is work with these, because they are fantastic tools that introduce people to mindfulness. What we don't want to do is for young people to think that that's all that there is, that there are only apps. Yeah. What I would say there is that there's a great argument going on at the moment in sort of meditation circles about apps and guided practices. It was interesting. Angie asked me at the beginning, before this, to guide a practice. I love guiding practices. I also love just silence, absolute silence. That's the tradition, I suppose, I learned it in. I was meditating before we had these instructions, if you like, and the way we language it now. And really, apps have now determined to some extent that a practice tends to be 10, 12 minutes, and there's a voice there. Yeah. And that voice is always bringing your attention back. And again, I think I would, rather than you remembering that your mind has wandered and bringing your attention back. And in terms of foundations of mindfulness in schools, give space to silence. I think that's so important. The metaphor that I've heard used is like bowling. Yeah, if you go bowling, 10-pin bowling, and you roll the ball down, kids tend to have the gutter, the barriers up at the sides. So the ball never goes into the gutters. It always hits the pins. And there was a lovely debate between a couple of people, who, and one of whom was describing. He said, you got to take the barriers down. You need the ball to run into the gutter sometimes. In other words, it's nice when the mind is allowed to just wander, and it might think about something else for 5 minutes, even if you're in a 10-minute practice. Every time there's a voice, it's bringing it back. Whereas if we just let that silence play out, maybe the child will remember and then bring it back themselves. And as practitioners, I think that ability for mindfulness to just kick in and bring you back is one of the great skills that we're teaching. So I suppose remember that in schools. You don't have to be talking all the time in schools. Okay, so those are the apps. Just for those of you who weren't here last week, I'm going to share this with last year. I'm going to share my favorite little story with you. I think it's also affecting perception of mindfulness as being monetized, instrumentalized, commercialized. And again, it's a good thing in some ways that this is growing into an industry, but this is a lovely little tale here. Went calm. This is an LA, I think it's an LA freeway, Los Angeles. That is such a sign that mindfulness is arriving, when beside a freeway, you've got a massive sign, calm, sleep with us. And then the competition there, when Insight Timer put one up very locally, don't pay others to sleep with you, come sleep with us for free. Yeah, the competition between apps is intense now, but also look how mindfulness is being defined. It's being defined in sleep. Yeah, sleep has become, and it's great that mindfulness is helpful for sleep, but it is so much more than that. And again, that is another perception, particularly for people who are not practicing, who are in your schools, which you need to just gradually chip away at and introduce wider contexts in. Perceptions. When you're trying to persuade people in schools, remember the evidence. Go to our website. There's a whole page. That's the MISP page on the evidence, and there's all sorts of goodies there that you can look at. But people want data, and this will give you some of that data. And the other thing about teachers, of course, is 2 things. Remember that to remind them of what good it does for them. This isn't just about the children. It's also about the teachers. And those are some of the things that can be improved by mindfulness, and those are some of the things that can be reduced. But again, I'm always cautious of instrumentalizing and making it too objective based, because actually one of my favorite quotes is this one that Jon Kabat-Zinn uses at the beginning of Full Catastrophe Living. It's about much more than those things. It's about life. It's about being human. It's about savoring the time that we have. So, you know, the more we can introduce mindfulness as something which improves our quality of living, our savoring of being alive, you know, that it isn't just about stress and well-being and academic attainment for teachers as much as kids. Okay, resources. I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm conscious I want to leave room for questions. The 3 resources that this paper mentions, which are key, are these. The first is teacher time. In any school, teachers are very busy, and somehow you in a school have to find a way of having teacher time, because of course the teachers aren't just teaching a lot of the time. They're doing their marking, they might be doing other activities. If they're senior managers, they're running a school. So how do you persuade people to give their time? And how do you persuade your head teacher? Maybe your head teacher, maybe she's not blocking, but maybe she's not keen and she's not blocking, but you still have to persuade her that this is worth some of her staff's time. Ideally, also, you want to give it curriculum time. And certainly at Tonbridge, this has been one of the great benefits, I suppose. We were the first school in the UK to put it on the curriculum for year 10. And it means that all the year 10's toes are dipped in mindfulness. And then it's up to them whether they carry it forward. But they've all had a bit of a go. But in some schools, it's hard, because, you know, if you want to get it in there, somebody in these subjects is going to have to lose a period. And teachers don't like losing periods. You know, they want all of the science teaching they can get, all of the English teaching they can get. So that can be quite contentious and difficult. And of course, the last thing is budget. It can cost money. And this is where I'm going to shift my hat slightly, because Mindfulness Schools Project is a UK charity. And the resources that I'm going to very quickly share with you now are available to you in certain circumstances, are available to you for free. And that ability to widen access to who can access our materials is important. We can't offer that overseas. We can't offer that in Asia Pacific. So if there is anybody out there, because we're a UK charity, if there is anybody out there, if there's anybody watching who would like, I will say this very quickly, I will unshare my thing here if I can, and now I can't. Yes, if there's anybody out there who wants to help us to support more disadvantaged communities in Asia Pacific, please get in touch, because we'd love to do that. But of course, that requires funding from as a charity as well. But let me come back to resources. Okay, so you've got these resources, and we have training and materials. And I'm going to flick through these because we're running out of time. But .begin is the 8-week course that we run. Lots of other 8-week courses. We're not saying you have to come on a mindfulness course with MISP, but an 8-week course taught by an experienced professional is crucial. We then offer these curricula. Angie mentioned at the beginning, .B, Pause B. DOTS is a new one we've got for preschool now. And we've also introduced something called .Breathe, which is for people who are less experienced in mindfulness. It's a 4-lesson easy introduction. And .B, for those of you who don't know why it's called .B, it might sound a bit cryptic, is because the dot is saying stop, just stop, and be, you know, and that's 10 lessons. And when you're standing in front of 30 kids and they don't want to learn, and it's a Tuesday afternoon, and they'd rather be at home, or they'd rather be on their Xboxes or on their social media or on their Instagram or on their, TikTok, you need stuff that you can show them. You need to be able to keep them interested and keep them engaged. And that's what lessons do. So we've got those lessons. We've got Pause B. I'll show you those. I think a lot of you will know this. This is all on our website. And DOTS, you might not be familiar with. DOTS is a preschool curriculum, which we've just written. But there was such a lot of demand for this. And we're delighted to be able to go to bring you DOTS. Now, why isn't this working? I can't get down a picture. There we go. Okay, and there's Breathe. Right, now I'm going to end up soon. Journey. Right, let's finish with the journey. I used this picture in my last talk. For me, what's fascinating about the journey is you might teach one child one day and they will love it. They will love it and they will think that mindfulness has changed their lives. The next year, they don't show up. You're running a class and they're not there. take that. Be prepared for that. That will happen. There'll be kids whose lives you think you've changed in year 10 who don't come in year 11. And then there'll be kids who in year 11 didn't have any interest at all who turn up in year 12. Yeah. Or there might be a 7-year-old it didn't connect with, but quietly you didn't think it connected with you, but actually they've kind of been doing it. They've kind of enjoying it. And it's only in year 9, only when they're 9 that they begin to get it, or at least let you know that they get it. And so it's not just a journey for the individual, it's a journey for the school. The school where you're working, it might be right at the beginning of that journey, or it might already be quite well established, but that can go up and that can go down. The key is this person, the grassroots activist person. If there's only one of you, if that person leaves, your journey will end quite quickly. So what you want to do if you are that person is make sure there are these people, make sure there are others following on. Anything could happen to you, or you might decide to leave, and you need these people. You need a team to be getting mindfulness in. Okay, so those are the 4 things again: community, resources, perceptions, and journey. My last point before questions is this. I think that, and this perhaps has changed, people used to, since when I was sort of beginning in this field and people were sharing thoughts, it used to be the case that mindfulness, we talked about having a mindful school. The whole school is mindful. I'm skeptical about that, certainly in secondary schools. I think what mindfulness should be is a healthy part of a school's ecology. Okay, in the same way that schools they offer lots of disciplines, all of which are respected, all of which people try, but then they have the ability to drop if they don't want to do it. That's what mindfulness should be. And you might be here, you might be outside the school's ecology at the moment, wondering how to get into this complex thing that is a school. Or you might already have it. It's a little cog in the great ecology. Or you might be here, where actually it's a really big cog in the turning wheels of your school or schools that you work in. But the key is that you see it as one part, one moving part of a lot of moving parts, and that you don't think that the whole of the tree has to be, in inverted commas, mindful. Because I think that would be like saying you want every single kid in the school to be more into maths than other things, or more into English than other things, or more at ease with numbers than they are at words. Children are different. Learning is different. What you want is everybody to know how to count, how to read, how to write, in the same way that they know how to practice mindfulness. Their toes been dipped in there. It's a skill, but then they can use it how they will. Okay. And finally, sorry, last slide. I show it every time I speak. Don't rush. Yeah, take your time. There's no rush. This is we call it Mindfulness in Schools project. Some people say, why is it a schools project? And, it's a 1,000-year project. It's going to take a long time. But be patient.